Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we continue the story of the Polish campaign in 1939. From the Nazi-Soviet Pact to Germany's so-called Blitzkrieg. Hi Jesse, another week, another podcast. Here we are again. I'm continuing the story of Poland and the Polish campaign in 1939. So last time we provided some of the context, a bit of the history, and now we're really getting to the outbreak of the war in 1939. As already said in the intro sentence, where do we start? Probably with the pact that I mentioned, or do you want to take it somewhere else first?
No, I think in the last episode, just to refresh everybody's memory very briefly, we kind of talked about, well, what happens in the 20 years? I mean, we went a bit further back too, but you can listen to the previous episode for all the details. What's the situation then in the 1930s? You have a second Polish Republic that has some very unhappy and very large and powerful neighbors in Germany and the Soviet Union. They're both unhappy about the borders. They feel like Poland shouldn't really have the right to exist as a country. And then there's, of course, the ideological aspect where the Germans are looking for Lebensraum. They're looking to, and the Soviets are looking to basically spread world revolution. So you have territorial ambitions about borders. Let's get back that territory that the Versailles Treaty took from us on the German side. Let's get back the territory that Poland took from us in the Polish-Soviet War on the Soviet side. And then you have the ideological side. And I think it's quite significant as we start talking about the campaign and what happens. And maybe we can even get into the occupations in the next episode, probably. This ideological idea that Poland doesn't have a right to exist, and on the German side, that its people are not equally human as Slavs, that's going to play a big role. But for the moment, in summer 1939, almost out of nowhere for many observers, the Nazi-Soviet Pact comes along. Why don't you, Matthias, give us the quick and dirty version of the Nazi-Soviet Pact that then allows the German invasion and World War II to begin?
So the Hitler-Stalin Pact, also called the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, these are the two foreign ministers at the time for Germany and the Soviet Union, comes as a huge surprise to everybody in the world, because you look at these two ideologies completely opposed, you might say, in particular when you look at what Hitler's always said all the way through his political career. It's all against, of course, against the Jews, but it's also against communism. Which, of course, in his idea, on his world, was kind of, well, the same thing, because the Jews run communism, they also run Wall Street, so it gets very, very complex and complicated. That's a different topic. So, and then suddenly, in the summer of 1939, in August, these two countries signed this treaty, and the entire world is completely confused. How and why does that happen? There is still a debate on this today, and particularly as to why Stalin signed this particular treaty. It's pretty obvious, or not pretty obvious, but perhaps a bit more obvious as to why Hitler signed this treaty, because that meant when he went to war against Poland, at this stage that had already been decided, that he wouldn't have to face a two-front war. Or maybe a two-front war, but on the Eastern Front, it would only, in inverted commas, be Poland, not Poland, plus potentially the Soviet Union as well. He was kind of hoping as well, and we'll get into a bit more detail later on, that the Western allies wouldn't do anything, would keep still and wouldn't get involved. So he would only have, in a perfect scenario, then have to deal with one enemy country, which was much, much weaker than Germany. So for him, that makes sense. The question and the debate is much more about the Soviets and Stalin. Why did he decide to sign this? Some people have said because he was a very clever thinker, so he was already looking forward. He thought that if Germany invades Poland, as then happens, the Western allies will get involved, which then means it will lead to another big war. As everybody expected in those days, that's going to be another First World War, lots of trench warfare perhaps, and a very, very long, costly, drawn-out war. And in the end, the Soviet Union would then be able to more or less just, slightly exaggerated, just walk across the plains of Central Europe and occupy everything because all these countries had been weakened. So this is if you give him the the kudos that he's a very, very strategic thinker. Or was it just because he really thought that going together with Germany, which was the rising power, or even one of the most powerful countries already in 1939 in Europe, would be a good idea because at least you can fulfill parts of your ambition. And that's really interesting when you then look at this treaty. What is in this treaty? So basically, the official part is a non-aggression treaty, to keep it very, very simple. I mean, there are lots of clauses in there, but that's really what it says. And that, you might say, okay, that is interesting, but everyone signs non-aggression treaties. In the last episode, we talked about the non-aggression treaties that Poland had signed with the Soviet Union and also Germany. So, okay, that's understandable. That is fine. Slightly strange when you look at these ideologies, but understandable. However, there's a secret protocol. And that is really the interesting bit, because in the secret protocol, Central and Eastern Europe was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. And that included all sorts of areas and all sorts of countries. So, for example, the Baltic states. At that particular time, it's not an episode about the Baltic states, but bear with me for 1 minute. At that particular time, you still had lots of Baltic Germans living there. And the Baltic Germans had been, let's call them the elite of this area. Hitler's main ideologist, Rosenberg, he came from there. He was a Baltic German. And they are then told to leave. And they basically have to leave and go back to Germany. And there are other areas that are part of this treaty as well. The most interesting and, of course, important one is Poland. And the Germans and the Soviets already decided that if it should come to a war, that Poland would be divided between these two nations. And it's interesting, which is quite often forgotten, that 51% of Polish territory was actually to go to the Soviet Union. So they were getting, as they did in the end, a bigger part of Poland than what the Germans got. However, you might say Germany gets the western part, which is more industrialized, more people living there. So again, you can look at each statistic as you want, as always. But that in itself is interesting because the Soviet side is quite often not written out or forgotten, but not really talked about when it comes to this, in particular because when we then see what happens, of course, on the 1st of September 1939. It's also interesting what then happens when you take this forward. Say they sign the treaty, then the war happens, and we'll talk about this in more detail later. And then after the war, of course, that is mildly embarrassing, you might say, particularly for the Soviet Union. So they signed a treaty with Germany, okay, and then the secret protocol with the Germans dividing up Poland. That's all a bit, isn't it? So it was actually officially all the way up to the 1990s that the Soviet Union denied ever having signed a secret protocol. The problem here is, of course, that when the Western Allies get into Germany in 1945, they find the German version of the secret protocol. So everyone in the West knew that existed, but the Soviets fundamentally denied this all the way to the 1990s, when, of course, you have the political changes in the Soviet Union, then Russia, and everything for a short period of time is a bit more open. So in many ways, a game changer, really a strategic game changer that you might say, particularly for the Germans and their understanding, makes the invasion of Poland only possible. Not quite sure if you want to say more about this. And that was very, very, I said, short. It's a very complex, a very detailed matter, of course. It's also interesting looking at the personalities. So Molotov, for example, and Ribbentrop are really interesting characters, each in their own way. But I think will probably take us a bit too far, too big a rabbit hole to go down to talk about these. So big game changer. And of course, it's a secret protocol, so people don't know it. But just the fact that you have this agreement, well, probably scared the Poles. And this is why the same time, actually even slightly earlier than that, you also have things happening in the Polish camp, and they're forging closer alliances with the Western allies. Not quite sure if you want to go there or whether you want to fill in some of the gaps or take it somewhere else.
I mean, we could do a series on the Nazi-Soviet Pact in and of itself. I know we say that all the time about almost every topic, but it's always true, people. The well has no bottom. The historical well has no bottom. What I would just add maybe as an extra detail, which might also be relevant if we're thinking about today's politics in Eastern Europe and the tensions and conflicts that are there, is the secret protocol also refers to Romania, because it has a region, actually two regions, Bessarabia, essentially, and part of Bukovina, which the Soviet Union wanted to have. And so eventually they will annex those later in 1940. Today, the country of Moldova is a separate, independent country, and it comes out of, essentially, in a way, the Soviet part of that secret protocol because they take it from Romania and create it as a socialist republic, Soviet Socialist Republic after that. And now, of course, Moldova is a part of the complications in Eastern Europe, with Russia supporting separatism and some Russian nationalists talking about eventually conquering it, annexing it, and so on. So there's a long, long, long shadow to many aspects of this secret protocol. The other thing I might just throw in there is sometimes the question is raised, well, why didn't the Soviets make a deal with the British and French? Germany was obviously the bigger threat to all of them. But I think historically there are a couple of weaknesses to that line of arguing. One is that, I mean, hindsight is 2020. Not everybody realized in the mid, even towards the later 1930s, just how far Germany was prepared to go. Some people did, and of course, now we look at them and say, hey, they were right. Some people point to Churchill. I know, Matthias, you're not the biggest Churchill fan, but he's often pointed out as someone who saw the threat more clearly than others. In any case, there were some agreements. Like France had a leftist Popular Front government in the mid 1930s, and they did sign a kind of agreement of sorts, not a super firm military alliance, but an agreement with the Soviet Union. The problem is the two systems are just incompatible. You can't really have that kind of agreement because the Soviets don't think that your system, your countries are legitimate and have a right to exist. They are just playing for time, theoretically. Of course, the Soviets acted a little bit more pragmatically very often, especially under Stalin. But theoretically, they want your whole society to collapse and into revolution, right? So it's very difficult. And the publics, the voting public in Britain and France, and certainly the political class and the elites, don't see what they can do with the Soviet Union. How is it going to be a reliable partner? It seems like a threat to spread its own system and revolution to them. So I don't find it that realistic to look back and say, oh, well, the Western powers were at fault because they should have made a deal with the Soviets, or they weren't keen enough on making a deal with the Soviets. How do you make a deal with Stalin's Soviets under those circumstances? Later, they make a deal with them out of survival necessity in 1941. But I'm hard pressed to really go back and bash on the British and French for not having made some grand alliance with the Soviet Union in the late 1930s. That's all I wanted to add to the Nazi-Soviet Pact because I've seen that kind of thinking and I'm not fully on board with it.
As you say, it's hindsight, isn't it? In 1939, no one saw it this way. And as you say, well, leading politicians, for example, in the UK, probably had less in common with the other Soviets than, well, most other regimes that you could find on this earth. So it's that's a very, very post-war or post-1939 argument, I would say. So I think if you'd signed some sort of treaty as a British Prime Minister in 1939, the British public would not have liked that. Let's put it mildly. So there we are. That's true. But it's also interesting because this treaty that they sign is just, perhaps you might say, the culmination of a lot of things that are going on in the summer and in the spring of 1939. So everyone can see that you're now moving towards some sort of conflict. And of course, this is primarily driven by Germany and by Hitler's foreign policy ideas. I think in the last episode, you already mentioned, so we talked about Munich and you also talked about Czechoslovakia, which is of course occupied by the Germans in March. So that starts on the 15th of March, after which you then get some guarantees from the Western powers, because everyone can see that whatever Hitler promises, basically is not the paper what it's written on. So that is the problem. Everyone knows at this stage, just looking at the map, the next target is going to be Poland, because who else could it be? So this is where that comes in. But then before that happens, the other smaller bits, we can again see where the Germans are flexing their muscles. On the 22nd of March, for example, Germany seizes the port of Memel in Lithuania, which had been German all the way to the end of the First World War. So again, it's very small again, but again, you can see a little bit of a land grab. And then on the 25th of March, so relatively early, Hitler then orders the preparations for Case Whitefall, the invasion of Poland. This did not come as a surprise to the military planners. So Hitler talked quite openly about his ideas of expansion and living space and all these things that are related. This is the first time actually in 1933, shortly after he is made Chancellor. And then there is another very famous meeting in 1937, and you have an adjutant there, it's called Hossbach. He writes a protocol, and that's very famous, the Hossbach Protocol, in which Hitler elaborates on war and living space and how to shape the future. So the military people knew what was going on. It's interesting then when you take it back to 1938, for example, everyone in Germany was expecting that the Western Allies would declare war on Germany if the Germans decide to invade Czechoslovakia, or, well, if the Munich Agreement hadn't happened, or what have you. There's actually a planned coup in Germany to overthrow him. The chief of the general staff, Ludwig Beck, resigns, not because he doesn't agree with the policy, but because he says the army isn't ready yet. So that is really interesting. Ludwig Beck then plays a very important role on the 20th of July as well. We talked about that in a different podcast. What you also have in March is that Hitler is beginning to put pressure on Poland. And he says, we want the city of Danzig, Gdansk, back. That is not a free city. That shouldn't be under the League of Nations. It shouldn't be more or less, it's a bit complicated, but let's call it more or less
administered by
the Poles. So it's a German city, needs to go back to Germany. We also want to have roads and railways that are German territory that go through the corridor. And the Poles, of course, well, they wake up and smell the coffee, and they start partial mobilization of their army. Now, they do that a number of times between then and September 1939, but there are a number of issues. The first of them is mobilizing the army is quite costly, it's expensive. You still have a bit of agriculture going on, a lot of agriculture in Poland, so you take these people in the summer out from the fields, that's not good. And also what is really interesting is that the French, the big ally of Poland, they tell the Poles not to do that because it would only provoke the Germans. So that's interesting in itself. So again, with the benefit of hindsight, not a very clever idea, but in the summer of 1939, or the spring of 1939, perhaps made a bit more sense. And because you can see that stuff is happening and stuff is brooding and it's moving towards war. So on the 31st of March, the British government for the first time gives guarantees that it will protect Poland, support Poland. It's still a bit, well, let's call it wishy-washy. It's not really clear what they're going to do. It's also difficult, isn't it? Because Britain is a naval power. The army is quite small. What can you do in a conflict like this? A little bit difficult. And then in May, you have meetings with between the Polish and the French general staffs. And they're talking about the situation. Because they think, well, war's going to break out. What's going to happen? And here the French promised the Poles that they will launch an offensive against Germany in the West 2 weeks after the German invasion. And this, for the Poles, now becomes the main strategic point around which everything really evolves. And we'll see later on when we talk about what actually happens on the field of battle, how this plays out. But this to them is what will save them, because they know that by themselves they don't stand a chance against Germany. And then that leads to the pact that we already mentioned. So the Germans and the Soviets signed it on the 23rd of August, 1939. So 8 days before the war, or 9 days before the war actually breaks out. So quite late. As I said, comes as a surprise. But there we are. As a consequence of this, because Britain now realizes that, this is not looking good, it now gives written assurance to Poland should Poland go to war with Germany. And so now, by the 24th of August, we basically have, the chessboard set, you might say, for what will happen then in September. Having said that, Hitler is still hoping that the Western Allies will not get involved, because he still thinks he got away with it so many times, I will probably get away with it another time. Have I forgotten anything from the spring of 1939?
Well, the thing that's like screaming in the back of my mind, listening to you sort of set that stage and go through these developments, are the parallels with today at a very sort of meta level. You have a smaller independent country in Central Eastern or Eastern Europe under threat by an aggressive imperial minded country looking for help from Western democracies that want to stop the imperial power, but are also very, very reluctant to take risks to do that, giving wishy washy security guarantees. I mean, if we need an example of the relevance of history, I think this would have to make the list as to how these things can play out and the different factors that lead to situations like the one we're going to talk about for the rest of this episode. So, where do we want to go from here, Matthias? My suggestion is we talk a bit about the plans, the war plans and operational plans on the German and Polish sides. Maybe I run through the German plan, then you flesh it out, and then we turn to the Poles that you've already hinted are really putting all their cards in the French basket here. So, all right, maybe I start with the Germans. You mentioned the plan is called Case White. What do the Germans plan to do? I mean, they kind of have a geographical advantage here. Poland is very flat, and I mean very flat, at least the part that the Germans are going to be rolling through. There are a few corners with some hints of Carpathians and so on in them, but those are far in the south. So the Germans have this East Prussia enclave that allows them to then, and of course, now they control the former Czechoslovakia. So that basically means the whole western half of Poland is surrounded on three sides by German controlled territory. And the Germans are also going to use this puppet Slovak fascist state that they've set up as another launching point. So what are they going to do? They're going to have two armies come down from East Prussia. So the idea is you can connect East Prussia with Germany proper, and you're going to put pressure on central Poland, where Warsaw capital is, from the north. And you can help surround Warsaw that way. The main German group has three armies, and it's coming from, let's say, the center and southeast. It's larger, it's got more tanks. They've got a few priorities. That's the one that also includes jumping off from the Slovak Republic. The Slovak state, I should say, is what I think it's officially called. There will be Slovak troops joining in this offensive as well. I think that's not very well known, but I think there are 3 divisions of Slovaks involved. So this main German group, they're going to move towards Warsaw, but they're also going to move through the southern part of Poland with eventually the target of the city that is now in Ukraine and known as Lviv, but which at the time was part of Poland and was known as Lvov, right? Lvov, you may also hear, that's the Russian word for the city. In any case, to achieve this, the Germans have about 1.5 million men, about 3,200 armored vehicles of different types, about 2,000 of those are tanks. But most of the tanks, as I'm sure, Matthias, you can speak to in a moment, are kind of small. They're not, the imposing panzers that we think about from later in the war. Only 300 tanks are Panzer IIIs or Panzer IVs. And the Panzer IIIs are even, relatively small by later war standards. The German army also, it has this armored corps. They have 6 armored divisions, 4 motorized infantry divisions, but everybody else, it's on foot and with horse and cart. So we're not talking about a fully motorized army. The British army is much more thoroughly motorized, for example, than the Germans at this stage. And of course, they want to make use, though, of these tanks in the way that they're going to kind of try to penetrate, try to surround and cut off Polish forces. But Matthias, you are the expert on the military side of things. Why don't you flesh out that general picture that I tried to draw of the German plan?
Well, I think you explained everything, haven't you? So then not much left for me to say, to be perfectly honest.
As usual, shortest episode ever. Thank you very
So
much.
I'll just find something to ramble on about anyway. So there we are. And geography, you already mentioned, is of course absolute key. And of course, we need to understand the map in 1939, which of course looks very different from what it looks today. So you've got, you might say these two, what do you want to call them? These two pincers sticking out in the north of German territory on the Baltic Sea, and of course going down into Silesia. And then you've got this big lump, you might say, sitting there, East Prussia. So as you said, Poland is pretty much surrounded already. The big question, the Polish mind, again, we'll come to that later, is of course what the Soviet Union is going to do. But they're completely disregarding this. We'll talk about the Poles a little bit later on. So what is it that the Germans want to achieve? Well, in very classical German military style, of course, they want to encircle the enemy forces. This is what you do. This is what then becomes known as Blitzkrieg, of course, this term, which is technically not correct because the Germans never used it. I think we've talked about this a number of times. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the first aim, of course, for the Northern Army Group under von Bock is to link up with East Prussia. So occupy these territories that they think, well, these are German territories anyway, we need to get these back. At the same time, you already mentioned it, you've got the main thrust coming in from the south with these three armies, so 8th, 10th, and 14th, pushing from the border to the northeast towards Warsaw. And then you've got a smaller attack coming in from East Prussia as well. So that's the other big pincer, you might say. And the idea really is to encircle the Polish forces, the bulk of the Polish forces, which are stationed to the west of Warsaw. Most of them at that particular stage are actually in Pomerania, in the Poznan, the Posen area. Why, we can talk about that later when we talk a bit more about the Poles. Now, there is a big debate in the German High Command. Where do we really go with our troops? Do we try to close this pocket to the west of Warsaw or to the east of Warsaw? And it's really interesting when you look at the debates that were going on in the German High Command. When you look at the people who were purely thinking in military terms, they said it's very, very clear we're going to the east of Warsaw because that means we're basically encircling all of Poland and no one can get out, and that's it. You then have the more strategic and geostrategic thinkers, and Hitler is part of them, even though Hitler kept kind of out of the whole strategic and also operational debate in Poland, very different from later campaigns. But the other school of thought said, well, that's not really good because we still don't know what the Allies are going to do. If the Western Allies attack in the West, we need to be able to shift troops quickly from the east to the west. If they're fighting to the east of Warsaw, that's not going to happen. So in the end, they settled for an encirclement to the west of Warsaw. But it's quite interesting. But they know that if they achieve that and achieve that quickly, they will have encircled the bulk of the Polish forces, and they can then deal with Warsaw and other parts later on. They were probably also already thinking ahead, going back to the Hitler-Stalin Pact, kind of expecting the Soviets to get involved in this war as well. Say, why would you try to conquer Turkey, which later had to cede to the Soviets anyway? And you talked about the composition of the force. I don't think I have to add much there. I mean, the Navy doesn't really play a large role, except for one episode. That's the opening scene of the war. But apart from that, the Navy,
one,
very famous one. But the Navy, apart from that, doesn't really do an awful lot. So we can probably disregard them. So it's really about the Air Force and, of course, the Army, because this is the German military. So it's all about the Army. You've given all the numbers. You've given all the facts. Perhaps the interesting thing is their training, is what is it that they're really trying to achieve here? When you look at the training that the Germans have, they're trying to do something that has become known as Blitzkrieg. In 1939, the German army is neither well equipped, you already talked about this, nor are the large parts of the army that well trained. We always talk about the training excellence of the German army. Well, you do find that in the 1920s and in the early 30s, when you've got a small army. Then the army expands very, very rapidly, from an army of about 200,000 men to several million. That means, well, you got a loss of quality. And that really will show later on when you go into the campaign. So we can, again, talk about this a little bit later. You're also still playing around with the structure of divisions, of corps, of brigades. This ongoing debate that you have in practically every army. How do you use tanks? I mean, by the German army, it's been decided now, so they're going to be used in tank divisions, not spread out amongst the infantry. But you can still see there's still quite a few people, traditional things. And well, I'm not quite sure if that is really the right way, whether they should be doing it a bit differently. And the cooperation with the Air Force was also a bit difficult at that particular time. I mean, the one thing the Germans, generally speaking, really had was very good radio communications. So the one thing that really you might say, if you want to use that term Blitzkrieg, what makes Blitzkrieg possible is radios. Every German tank had a radio on board. And you also have radio communication between the army and the Air Force. However, you do not have such a joined up approach between the army and the Air Force that you can talk of close air support. So where you get a message from the army, can you please bomb this particular bunker or whatever it might be. So the targets, the strategic targets, operational targets have been chosen by the Air Force beforehand, and all the other targets were chosen by Air Force personnel, sometimes even without consulting with the army. So you can see there's still quite a bit of learning going on, and it's the whole system is still a little bit clunky. But when you just look at the sheer numbers that they've got, well, everyone knows that sooner or later the Germans are going to win. The Germans are expecting a very, very swift victory. They're thinking they're going to cut through the Polish defensive line like a hot knife through butter, and it's all going to be over very, very quickly. As we will see when we talk about the actions, the opening battles are actually quite brutal, are quite nasty, and quite often the Germans actually do get a bloody nose. Another thing that might be interesting is when you look at the senior commanders. So you've got the two army groups. You've got von Bockes in the north, and then you've got von Rundstedt in the south. These are typical Prussian officers. They are First World War veterans. They are from the aristocracy. Rundstedt was called the last Prussian. So this is really the old stock of the German military. It's really interesting when then fast forward a few years and look how all this has changed. Rundstedt remains, but you then get a younger generation coming up. And you've got a lot of very, very famous names. Manstein is the chief of staff there, for example, and lots of other generals who, of course, then later on make their name. I mean, we don't need to go through all of them here because, again, that would take far too long. But it's interesting. You still have, in many ways, you might say, this is the embodiment of the old army, which had been trained in the 1920s, also in the thinking, in the approach, in its ethos of the old army that had been trained in the 1920s, early 1930s. It's not, what's the right term, a proper Nazi army, even though, of course, you've got atrocities. We can talk about this later on as well. We can talk about Blaskowitz, but we can talk that later. So it's still a different type of army that you would find, for example, from 1942 onwards. It's a different ethos. It's also very, very different equipment. You mentioned it. Well, to a large degree, the German soldiers march into battle like their fathers had done in 1914 and their grandfathers had done in 1871. They're not marching. They're probably on horseback. You do have the tank divisions. These tanks are not, as you already mentioned, not particularly good, the bulk of them. Probably the best one that is available in larger numbers is the Skoda tank, which is a Czech tank, which they continue to produce when they took over Czechoslovakia. So even on the German side, you can see this is not the Wehrmacht that a lot of people think of when you think about Wehrmacht. Again, coming back to the point I think I raised in the previous episode, quite often people just brush over this particular campaign. It's over so quickly. Of course, the Germans win. What can we learn from this? There's actually a lot that we can learn. And there's also a lot that the Germans learned from this campaign. There's a very, very, very steep learning curve that you find on the German side. I think that's enough of a ramble.
I thought it was interesting, personally. I also thought of a tangent. Here we have a tangent alert, folks. What I want to do is now talk a bit about the Polish operational plan and the forces that they had available. But quickly, I want to wedge in something. You mentioned the keyword Blitzkrieg and that it wasn't really official doctrine. We did a whole episode about that. We did an exclusive war room follow-up further discussion about that. And I heard something the other day on a podcast. It's like a security defense podcast from France called Le Collimateur. And they had a guest by the name of Quentin Sancier, who I had the pleasure of working with on one project a few years ago. He also runs an awesome, now he only runs it occasionally for work-related purposes, but he runs a very interesting YouTube channel in French, for those of you out there who understand French, called Sur le Champ. In any case, he had this sort of little snippet definition of, well, when can you consider something a doctrine or not? And he sort of framed it like this. Well, if it's written down somewhere as a concept in the doctrine books, or if the commanders and army personnel and so on, they're using a term to mean something and that is consistently applied and everybody knows it means this and then they're doing it. So I thought that was quite an interesting wrinkle that I don't think we explicitly, we did talk about that, but I just thought he kind of brought it right onto the head, that if it's not written down somewhere in a document and it's not being then used on the ground between the professionals who are to apply it, well, maybe it's not such a doctrinal concept. And that I think applies to this Blitzkrieg example. You're the doctrine expert here, Matthias. I don't know.
Well, I was just thinking as we were talking, I think the "and" part is really important, because just writing something down does, well, you've got something in writing,
Right.
but it does not mean that it gets applied. Having been
Right.
involved in some doctrine writing and knowing a lot of people write doctrine, and it can be quite frustrating, to be perfectly honest. Some armies or militaries are, if that's the right word, better at least reading their doctrine. Other nations are, well, quite shockingly bad when it comes to it. So it is, you need to have it written down and then you need to apply it. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons, again, we talked about in the other episode, as to why some nations apply a coherent doctrine more than others. It has to do with history, the structure of the army, the task of the armed forces as well. There is this famous saying, and no one knows whether it's really true, but it's being used all the time. When Rommel, of course, everything to do with, it's a British quote really, so it's everything with Britain and the Germans is always Rommel. Rommel apparently said, well, the British have got the best doctrine in the world, thank God they never read it. So that sums it up quite nicely. And there is that. But the Germans actually, to a large degree, were more of doctrine followers than perhaps some other nations, you might say. But having said that, if we want to switch it again to the Polish, well, the Polish are also very much on the doctrine side here, because their military tradition, their military structure, their military thinking is very much aligned with the French. And the French, even today, are very big on doctrine, coherent and cohesive approaches. The same as, by the way, you find in the US Army, which is also based to a large degree on the French Army. So you can see, again, different nations do it a bit differently. And then, of course, the important thing is, do you have the right doctrine? And even that might be the wrong term, because one doctrine that works for one scenario might not necessarily work for another scenario. This is where flexibility comes in. You need to have the flexibility. If you don't have that, and if you only follow the textbook that you find, everything you find in the doctrine, then you've got a problem. I talked about this in one of the episodes where I talked about German doctrine, which it makes very, very, very clear that it's all about flexibility. So that was a big tangent, wasn't it? Yeah, that was a pretty big one.
I knew it had the potential because it was about doctrine, which is in your neck of the deep dark woods. Let's put it that way. Okay, but back to the Poles in August 1939. How do they want to try to defend their country? What means do they have to do it? As we mentioned, they're depending on these security guarantees from Britain and France and the formal alliance with France and this French commitment to launch an offensive against Germany within 2 weeks. So the Poles kind of have this dilemma, right? They don't have a mountain range that they can anchor their defense on. So what do? They're also the weaker party here against the Germans, which puts them in a real bind. If they concentrate their defense and they basically say, okay, we're not going to defend the western third of the country. We're just going to give that up because it's surrounded on 3 sides. We're just going to make a stand on whatever is the most convenient river/forest line in front of Warsaw. Then you're essentially giving the enemy a whole lot of free territory, free resources, depriving yourself of that, and you're probably going to scrap a lot of your morale in your civilian population and also in your military. On the other hand, if you say, well, okay, we are going to defend ourselves in this giant pocket, and we're going to make a half moon through all of the western 2/3 of Poland and try and defend everything, you're probably going to be too weak along that line to prevent the enemy or even hold back the enemy for a significant amount of time. There is, you'll be happy to hear, Matthias, although I'm sure you know it already, a famous saying from your most famous German, Frederick the Great: he who defends everything defends nothing.
Absolutely.
And essentially, the Poles decide to defend everything. But it kind of makes sense in a way, I think, because if your only hope is for the French to attack in the West, then all right, it's maybe worth trying to slow down the Germans from the get go. If you feel like the Germans will not have the ability to really crush you because they're going to have to transfer most of their army to the West in, let's say, a week or two, maybe you can then preserve more of your territory than if you were to give it up without a fight at the start, right? So that's the horns of the dilemma that the Poles are wrestling with, and they decide to go for an all-round defense. In order to do that, they have about 1 million men. They have 38 infantry divisions. They have only one motorized division. They have a fair bit of cavalry, 11 brigades. They have about 1,100 armored vehicles, which is like a third of what the Germans have. And most of those are fairly outdated as well. They have something like 750 aircraft, but those are also behind the Germans in terms of technology and this kind of thing. So that's what the Poles are working with. As you mentioned, I think it was this episode, maybe the previous one, they all merge into a beautiful flow of consciousness and tangents all mixing together. That they're still completing their mobilization when the Germans step over the frontier. And part of the reason for this is that the British and French don't want them to provoke the Germans, so they kind of get them to delay parts of the mobilization. Hindsight's 2020, but that looks pretty bad in hindsight.
Absolutely. And also when you then, again, well, keep it with the British and the French. So when they realize what's going on, they then start or want to start supplying the Poles with more modern equipment. But of course, then it's too late. And if memory serves correctly, I think they get, is it 1 battalion or 2 battalion of modern British tanks? I think that's it. But that battalion or the 2 battalions don't see a lot of action. So you can see it's too late. They'd also agreed to send Hawker Hurricane fighter planes, for example. They don't make it into Poland on time either. So that's the problem. And when you look at the Polish disposition of force, again, it's very interesting because, as the other famous German said, Karl von Clausewitz, war is simply continuation of policy by other means. And this is very, very clearly played out here because this decision to have a forward defense, so defend all of the territory, is in the end a political decision. And you already mentioned a number of reasons. It's morale, it's giving up territory, which always seen as bad, even though you might argue in pure military terms, terrain doesn't have a value all of its own normally, unless it's key or vital terrain. But now we're getting tactical, so let's forget about that. But there's another reason why this is very, very important, because this area, so Pomerania, Poznan, West Prussia, these areas, these are the more developed areas. So you've got more industry, you've got more general output, and also this is where the majority of the population lives. I'm not entirely sure, I think it's about 60% of the population live in these areas. So if you surrender this very early on or decide not to defend it, you either surrender, if 60% is correct, 60% of your men force, so potential soldiers and airmen and sailors, to the enemy, or you need to get them out, you need to evacuate them, and then you need to supply them in a different part of the country. Just think about the logistical issue. Think about where do you keep depots. All these things make it very, very difficult. So in the end, the political decision is taken to defend with a forward defense. So there is an input from the French chief of the general staff, for example. He advises the Poles to surrender all of this and say, no, withdraw to the Vistula. They've got a perfect defensive line, and this is where you hold. And just do that for the 2 weeks or so. And then we're going to launch an attack in the West, which, by the way, open bracket, the French were not really on planning, because internally at that stage, they had already decided all they were going to do was going to have some sort of recce-in-force intrusion into Germany, but not a major offensive, which is also maybe another slight tangent, which is one of the reasons why even today in Poland, you find sometimes a bit of an Western European, of course, also anti-Soviet mood. So the only people they really do trust in Poland internationalize are, of course, the US. They don't really trust, of course, the Germans. They don't trust the French. They don't trust the British. They don't trust the Russians / the Soviets. So that makes it really quite difficult. And again, you've got a very interesting legacy, one of these long shadows of World War II, which still today shapes thinking in that particular part of the world. So yes, from a pure military point of view, perhaps withdrawing to the line might have perhaps been better. At least got a defensive line, but then you've got all the other factors, and that is why they decide to fight there, realizing that they're probably not going to be able to hold the Germans. This is why when you look at the corridor that they're defending, so between East Prussia and mainland Germany, the Polish forces there are relatively weak. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's only two infantry divisions. So they're supposed to be conducting a fighting withdrawal. So you withdraw, but do it slowly. And that gives the time, first of all, to mobilize the rest of the forces, but also the French to then get going in the West. Again, when you look at the mobilization, how it's conducted, it's difficult. We already talked about it. So they have partial mobilization. They want to order mobilization. The French say, no, that's not a good idea. Don't do it. When they finally order it, it's basically too late. So a number of the Polish units only have somewhere in the region of perhaps 60% of the manpower when the war breaks out. So that, of course, is another complicating factor that you find on the Polish side. And so you also talked about the equipment. So it's mainly outdated. The doctrine that they're using is also difficult. It's an interesting combination that you find. On the one hand, you've got a very strong French influence, which is very methodical battle. On the other hand, you have a very strong legacy of a war of movement, particularly the legacy and the memory of the 1920 war against the Soviet Union. And so this really shapes thinking. But then these two don't really come together. And you can also see that in the equipment that they have. For example, the tanks that they've got, most of them are not even tanks. They're called tanklets. So basically, they're very thinly armored, mostly not more than people personnel carrier. So they're not, even the German tanks are bad, but compared to the Polish tanks, they're still superior. So that's another complicating factor that you find in the Polish army. And then, of course, you talked about it already. You have very strong cavalry contingents. Again, this is, you might say, one of the legacies, or an idea that goes back to the 1920s. The famous Polish cavalry, they were not really using the lances anymore. That's gone out of fashion. It's mainly the saber, or they were supposed to be used as basically dragoons, which is mounted infantry. You ride somewhere, then you dismount, you fight as infantry. But you have quite a lot of these because, particularly in the eastern part of the country, which of course is not really where you're fighting now, but again, it made its way into the military DNA, you might say, horses are still extremely useful because the road network is not great. As, for example, the Germans will then find out in 1941, 1942. So it makes sense to have them there. Makes perhaps a bit less sense if you put them against modern German forces. Having said that, they perform extremely well. Again, we'll go into the details later on. And there are actually a number of incidents where the Polish, not all the Polish forces alone, but in particular, the cavalry managed to drive German forces back. And then, of course, you've got the great myth of the Polish cavalry, the cavalry charge against German tanks. Do you want to talk about this now, or shall we leave it to later?
No. Let's save it. Let's save it. Let's give everybody a cliffhanger. We will talk about the myth of the Polish cavalry charge against German tanks in, I imagine, the next episode, because, ladies and gentlemen, listeners out there, viewers out there, now that we're on YouTube as well, I think, unless, Matthias, you've got anything else here, but I think we can bring this episode to a close. We've now brought the story from the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which basically enables the Germans to invade, through to all the considerations about who's planning what, how the Germans are planning on conquering Poland, and how the Poles were hoping to be able to defend their country. And in the next episode, we will get to the campaign itself, to the invasion itself. We haven't forgot about the Soviets. We will come back to them as well. So unless you need a closing word, Matthias, give me a sign. No? Good. For once, we're good. We have no tangents to add, except for thanking one of our supporters. I want to take this opportunity before we let you go today to thank Ethan Hughes from the United States of America, who's a colonel level supporter of the podcast. Thank you so much, Ethan, for your help. You and all the other supporters make it possible for us to do what we're doing here. Listeners and viewers out there, if you're interested in becoming a supporter like Ethan and all the others, you can visit our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. There you can sign up and become a supporter. You can also get access to extra and exclusive content like in our war room. You can even try that out for free for 1 month if you use the code Deep Dark Woods. You'll also get maybe a bit of preference if you have a question that you'd like us to do an episode on, that kind of thing. So thanks again to Ethan and all the other supporters, and we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Don't know why the Germans love these colored war plans. Reminds me of well, actually, I find it a better way of naming your operations than a lot of the cheesy operations of more recent times, like Operation We're the Good Guys. I'm paraphrasing slightly to not offend any listeners from or viewers from any particular country, but Operation We're the Good Guys, Operation We're going to come and hand out ice cream to children, or whatever, right? I think white, yellow, red, blue is a much better way to go for our operation naming.